Ukrainians woke up this morning to find that Donald Trump has cut off their nation from military aid. As Ukrainians continue to fight against Russia's invasion, the rift between Kyiv and the White House continues to grow. Mr. Trump has directed U.S. assistance to Ukraine to be halted as he seeks to pressure Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to engage in peace talks with Russia. This morning, Ukraine's chair of foreign affairs told the BBC that the decision feels like Mr. Trump is siding with Russia.
To me and to my colleagues in the parliament and to all Ukrainian people, it came as a shock. Because on the surface, this decision looks as a disastrous decision, especially right now, when we are in desperate need of American weaponry, American support. To suspend military aid to Ukraine, it looks like siding with Russia. And it's extremely dangerous because, as far as I know, this suspension also encompasses air defense systems, missiles for air defense systems. And it's dangerous. In Kiev, in other cities, we're being bombarded and shelled by Russia each day. And we might see very soon the serious consequences, dangerous consequences on that. And I'm appealing to Mr. Trump not to play with these dangerous issues because we're talking about lives, human lives of Ukrainians. And if you stop giving us weaponry, we cannot defend ourselves effectively. We cannot save lives of people.
And at this morning's press conference on tariffs, Prime Minister Trudeau addressed Trump's decision to pull aid from Ukraine.
Canada and Canadians are very clear. We know who our friends are. We know who our opponents are. And there is no question that Vladimir Putin and his attack not just on Ukraine, but on the rules-based international order, on the founding principles of the United Nations, is an opponent of Canada. I think the question that we all need to be watching closely is, what do the American people think? How do Americans feel about jettisoning one's friends and allies in favor of a country that has never wished Americans well and continues to act in ways that harm the global economy and specifically the American economy and American values and principles?
We're now joined by columnist Adam Zivo, who recently returned from Ukraine. Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, what was your reaction this morning to the news that the U.S. has pulled military aid from Ukraine, and how much of an impact do you think this is going to have on Ukraine's ability to defend itself?
I'm aghast. Everyone who I know who is in Ukraine, whether they're Ukrainian, whether they're a volunteer, whether they're a journalist working at the grassroots level, they're all aghast too. We all knew that Donald Trump had sympathies towards Russia. We didn't expect the situation to deteriorate so completely and so quickly. And I think that obviously this is going to impact Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The main thing, though, is that Ukraine currently receives about 30% of its military material from the United States. It produces 40% and receives 30% from the Europeans. So as of now, from my understanding, they'll be okay for the next 2 or 3 months. But after that point, the situation might become quite dire. And though the Europeans have committed to stepping up and providing additional aid to fill the gap left by the United States, they lack the industrial base to fully substitute for U.S. weapons.
And you actually just returned from the Ukraine. Now, have you reached out to any of your contacts there to see how they're reacting to this news?
There's no need to reach out. I see it all over their social media. Everyone is horrified by it. And one of the things that really frustrates me is that Trump and his allies have portrayed this as an act of sympathy to everyday Ukrainians. They've attempted to portray Zelensky as some kind of dictator who is pushing everyday men and women into war against their consent. That's not the reality on the ground at all. And anyone who believes that narrative is someone who hasn't taken the foot inside Ukraine or hasn't listened to Ukrainians at all. Ukrainians are deeply afraid of Russia. They know what it's like to live under Russia because Ukraine was subjected to Russian domination for centuries. Right. And they know what it's like in the occupied territories. I have been in liberated areas. I've had friends who've been in the torture chambers. Right. And so when they hear that their country is essentially being disarmed so that they can be pushed into a bad peace with Russia which will likely, accumulate in another invasion in a few years from now. No one's happy with that.
And in terms of military aid, what exactly does Ukraine need in order to be able to fend for themselves?
Well, I mean, they need, for example, additional air defense systems. So last year, when the Republicans blockaded aid for 6 months, air defense, they ran out, right? They didn't have enough rockets to intercept the missiles. And this had a direct impact in that attacks on Ukrainian cities further away from the front lines increased dramatically, and their ability to hit critical infrastructure increased dramatically. So my friends, my loved ones in Ukraine had to live without electricity last summer because the electrical grid was destroyed, because air defenses were depleted because of these Republicans. So we'll probably see that again as well. We need tanks. We need additional drones. Although thankfully the Ukrainians produce their own drones, so maybe they can fill in that gap themselves. But on the whole, Ukraine needs every kind of weapon it can get its hands on.
Now, with the United States pulling out their military aid, the UK hosted over the weekend lots of world leaders in Europe to talk about what they can do and how they can boost their defense spending in order to support Ukraine. Is there a way that Europe can actually rally enough military aid to help Ukraine, or is this not looking good?
I mean, they can increase their military aid, but the thing is that they should have started increasing their production 3 years ago. We've been warning them again and again and again that if they don't step up earlier, then they're going to pay more later, which is happening, right? So they've committed to spending maybe around 5% of their GDP on defense, which is far higher than they currently spend. I mean, many of them were spending around 2%. But you can't just turn that money into weapons right away. You have to build your industrial capacity, and that takes time. And they could have spent the past 3 years doing that, but they didn't. So while I think that it will be helpful, I think that Ukraine is going to go through a very difficult period for the next year or two if the war does continue.
Now, I want to go to the encounter that Zelensky and Trump had in the Oval Office because it's left a lot of mixed reviews. A lot of people are quite disgusted with the way Trump reacted, and other people are actually agreeing with the things that he's saying about Vladimir Zelensky. So following that meeting, Zelensky said this morning that the Oval Office feud was regrettable. Do you think that should have been handled differently?
I don't think Zelensky could have done anything to avoid what happened, because I think watching through that 45-minute conversation, it pretty clearly seemed like an ambush, right? It seemed like this was premeditated. And the chancellor of Germany, for example, from the new government that was just voted in, agrees with that, right? The first 35 minutes were amicable. Everyone spoke with mutual respect. There was obviously divergence in how they understood the war. Zelensky emphasized the suffering of his people. He emphasized the fact that 20,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped by Russian forces. He emphasized the fact that Ukrainian POWs are being beaten and tortured and starved. Whereas Trump tried to create a moral equivalency between the two sides. Zelensky correctly pointed out that Ukraine needs security guarantees, given that every single ceasefire Russia has signed in the past has been broken by Putin, right? This isn't the first time that someone has proposed diplomacy. This isn't the first time a ceasefire could be signed. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. Since then, there have been over a dozen ceasefires, and none of them have worked. So in that context, it makes sense for the Ukrainian president to say, well, how can you ensure that we're actually protected? And then J.D. Vance blew up on the Ukrainian president in a really petulant and hectoring manner that I thought was, really just disgusting to see. And his reaction was so disproportionate to what Zelensky said that it seems like what Zelensky said was irrelevant. It seemed like J.D. Vance just wanted to humiliate Ukraine.
Now, since that encounter, a lot of senior U.S. officials are saying that Zelensky should step down. What do you make of that claim?
It's ridiculous, right? So Zelensky has the broad support of his voters. So the most recent polling data puts his approval rating at around 60%, which, by the way, is far higher than that of Donald Trump's. The Ukrainian constitution prohibits elections from occurring during wartime because, it's destabilizing, right? So in World War I, both Canada and the UK didn't have elections. In World War II, the UK didn't have elections because guess what? If you bring people to a polling booth when your cities are being bombed, that creates a security problem. And that can be used strategically to disrupt an election to, for example, advantage certain candidates. So this idea that Zelensky, a broadly popular president, should step down because he didn't act obsequiously enough to Trump, like that's absurd. And of course, it creates a further risk of election interference on Russia's end. It feels like essentially that the United States wants to replace Zelensky with a puppet that will simply give up Ukraine and betray, the Ukrainian nation.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for the time today.
Well, thanks for having me.